Chelsea is going to speak from the perspective of a neighborhood association, just their thoughts, and then we can come back together as a group and ask questions. Since it's a panel, they can also just ask questions of each other or make comments to each other about what they said. And the rules for engagement, I would say, are, so raise your hand if you want to ask a question after they're done speaking. If you've already asked the question, we just ask, it's part of our code of conduct, that you take a step back and maybe make room for other people. I would probably call someone new if you've already spoken, you have your hand up. And then to keep your comments to no more than 2 minutes so that we can make room for everyone. And yeah, not speak over other people. You all know how it goes. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to say, but I don't think so. So with that.
Hello, my name is Sabrina Wilson. I work with the Office of Community and Civic Life. Thank you for inviting us, Sabina, into this space to be able to share with you a little bit about what's been going on with this code change that we've been hearing about in Chapter 3.96. And I'll pass it so you can introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Winta Johannes. I'm a policy advisor in Commissioner Udaley's office, where I serve as her liaison to the Office of Community and Civic Life.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Powers. I'm the chair of the Brentwood-Darlington Neighborhood Association.
Well, thank you again for having us tonight. Through this process, I've learned a few things. One of them is that 5 minutes goes by really, really fast to explain what has been a year-long process. And so I will not attempt to explain every part of the code, but I hope that you will look at what is actually in the proposed language. And then I'm just going to highlight a few things and then turn it over to Sabrina for her to do the same. So, I want to start by saying that through this process, the most meaningful part for me has been really to see people coming together to say, we really want to contribute, and how can we do that? And how can you as city government facilitate our process to be able to do that? And that is actually a really, really powerful thing. So I just want to start there. But because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to dive right in and, of course, take questions. So I think maybe the first question is, why are you doing this? What's up with the code update? And I will say, this has been called into question many times over the 45 years that this Bureau has existed. At different points, whether it's in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and as recent as 2016 when the Bureau was audited, the question has been, is this Bureau serving the function that it was intended to serve? And what exactly is that function? And every time that we've asked that question, what's come to the forefront is that if this Bureau is intended to serve all Portlanders, it does not do that. If the focus is on the neighborhood structure, not everyone wants to participate in that structure. And so what are the ways that we bring people into that structure? And I think the different question maybe that we're asking now is, how do we recognize people who are organizing in lots of different other ways? And so if I have to summarize what this code does, I would say it does a few things. One, it really focuses on what is the Bureau's responsibility to create the conditions for civic engagement. And in doing that, it pulls away from dictating to communities how you must run your meetings, what your board should look like, and instead says, what is the Bureau responsible for providing you? How do we actually create the conditions so you can connect with your neighbors, so that you can connect with city government? And that is actually the most significant sections in this. But to do that, it also acknowledges the reality of how we got to today's democracy. And last, I want to call your attention to this last section, what we were just referring to as 060, recognized organizations. So if we have built a system that is working really well for some, that is excellent. And if we want it to work for others, that is not going to happen overnight. And in our attempt to create an even better system, we don't want to take away the rights and privileges that those who are being served by the current system enjoy. And so what this last section does is for organizations that are already recognized, which are neighborhood associations, district coalitions, business district associations, and diverse civic leadership partners, they get to continue to get city notifications and the benefits that already exist as a result of benefits that come from other parts of city code. So that stays in place until the next question is, of course, well then how do we extend those benefits to other groups? And that is going to take lots of bureaus working together. So what will come with this code change will be a resolution that directs a multi-bureau work group to come up with what that system looks like. And until then, the groups that enjoy those benefits continue to, and we say that is not enough. Our current system of engagement is not enough. Us dictating to you what your rules of engagement should be is not us facilitating meaningful civic engagement. And so I will turn it over to Sabrina shortly. And I think the last thing that I want to say is that we recognize that there are lots of barriers to civic engagement. And some of those barriers are things like insurance. And actually lots of groups need insurance to have events. And so what this code does is not take away your insurance. It just forces the Bureau to say, and how do we provide insurance to other small groups, small grassroots groups, because this is not a unique thing. And we know that in 2019, we should be able to support, as the Civic Engagement Bureau, organizations and groups that come together across place, across identity, and across issue. We don't have to choose. And when we work together across those three areas, that's actually when we are successful as community. And so with that, well, one last thing. Sorry, I'm telling you, the 5 minutes goes so fast. The very last thing is that the thing that's not in this document, which if you're familiar with our current code, is the standards, right? That's where all the rules are for what the currently recognized groups look like. Our proposition is not that by taking away those standards, we no longer recognize you. That is what this last section 060 does. It continues to recognize you. But it says, what are the benefits of recognition? All it is, those benefits are being put on a directory and having access to information. We're saying we don't need you to follow open meeting requirements, and we don't need to tell you what your board needs to look like for us as government to make sure that you have access to notifications. This administrative rule, and you will see it this week probably, will simply be all of the organizations that exist. It will be all the neighborhood associations and all the business districts. And you don't have to do anything because you are here. And so because you are here, because we are government, we will continue to give you those notifications and other benefits and recognize that that is not enough and we need to develop better systems.
Just want to say something really quickly. Because I know there's some people here where this is their first time. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands what this conversation is about. And I don't know if we've made that clear. Just like in terms of, so Winta and Sabrina are representatives of the Bureau that oversees neighborhood associations. So the Office of Community and Civic Life oversees neighborhood association like us. There's 95 of them in Portland. And the rules for engagement, the proposal is for the rules of engagement to change a little bit in the sense that right now neighborhood associations are seen as privileged over other community groups. We are seen as official voices of the neighborhood, which potentially, and I'm not expressing like personal opinions here, but I'm just saying like how I think this might be relevant to people. When we receive those privileges, it kind of potentially excludes other community groups that don't organize based on their geographic location, but maybe, like I said earlier, organize based on their identity or culture. So the proposed changes are kind of just trying to make everyone more even, bring more voices to the table is what Civic Life says, right? Bring more voices to the table, recognize more groups, empower more groups, make it so that more groups can have access to insurance or grants or, yeah.
Can I add just a little bit
Please
to
do,
that?
please
Yeah,
do.
so the code change is for Chapter 3.96. That's what you might have heard. Every bureau in the city of Portland has a piece of the city code. We're not changing all of city code. That's not our job. We don't have that power to do that. It's one piece, Chapter 3, that talks about the duties and functions of each bureau. Every bureau has one, and when I follow up with Sabina, I'll make sure that I share some of those, just so you know every bureau has one. And this is the one that talks about the duties and functions of the Office of Community and Civic Life. So we've gone on a process through a committee, through community engagement, engaging a diverse range of and cross-section of Portlanders from our houseless community to hosting sessions in Somali and Russian and Vietnamese, and I believe someone here was at one of the sessions as well, and going out to communities and meeting them where they are to talk about really what can this bureau do to support civic engagement, to support all Portlanders, no matter how they come, recognizing that people come geographically, people come through their identity, people come through their affinity, and people form in many different ways, including just coming as themselves, calling in. I've had many conversations with folks and emailing us. And so again, this conversation is what should the Bureau be doing to ensure that we're supporting all Portlanders. As government, that's the role that we should be taking. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of, in addition to the background that was given on kind of what this process is for those who may be new or first time having this conversation. So I know we've taken up a bit of time, so I'll pass it along, and then I'm happy to answer questions.
Go ahead and give any more background or anything that's relevant.
No, I think it's a pretty good brief summary. I could go on and on.
Okay. So I will tell you off the bat, I forgot my clear glasses, so I can only see you guys sort of. And my brain is not working very well. Very glad school is starting tomorrow. So I have a small child. So I'm Chelsea, and I've been volunteering with the Brentwood-Darlington Neighborhood Association for almost 4 years. After seeing a post on Nextdoor, I staggered into a national night out event as a stay-at-home mom with a potty-trained toddler in a new neighborhood in a rental. I was a hot mess. I was desperate for adult conversation and purpose that didn't involve arguing with a miniature version of myself. In the last few years, BNA has grown with a solid group of dedicated volunteers doing the hard work of showing up again and again. We received a $5 million grant for sidewalks. Currently, we throw 4 to 6 free events a year. We support our local schools, we host neighborhood cleanups, we do advocacy, and more. That's all now at risk because of proposed changes to Code 3.96. I know they say it's not going to change. So what I want to know first is how many of you knew about the code change before it came up on the Neighborhood Association agenda? How many of you would expect the city to contact everybody if they were making big changes to city code? Okay, they don't intend to do that. They don't have the capacity, they say. Okay, so that brings me to the first of our big concerns, and some of this language is pulled from a letter our neighborhood association wrote, and I will give you a link at the end for that. So our first concern is lack of transparency and communication from Civic Life during this process. Starting with the rebranding and continuing throughout, Civic Life has shown a disregard for public input and due process. The proposed language is lofty and unclear and gives an excessive amount of unchecked personal power to the position of the director. Another big concern is financial responsibility. The November 2016 audit by the city showed a severe mismanagement of funds within Civic Life, which was then Office of Neighborhood Involvement, resulting in extremely inequitable financial distributions favoring affluent, gentrified neighborhoods. It showed neighborhoods in the Central Northeast Coalitions received $6 per resident, while neighborhoods in East Portland Coalition received only $2 per resident. There are no proposed changes in 3.96 to correct any of these financial inequities or prevent future funds mismanagement. That brings us to, how will the proposed changes do what they intend? The goals of this code changes are laudable. I want inclusion, amazing communication, and the ability to help every neighbor. But there's nothing in the code change that does that. There's no plan for attracting and communicating with the diverse groups that the city currently struggles to reach. These code changes will remove all rules keeping neighborhood associations in check and transparent. The city will no longer have power over neighborhood associations unless they require funding. This is alarming, as the city has had to invoke Code 3.96 twice recently to prevent discriminatory bylaw amendments. It's our hope that civic life pauses so that we can come together as citizens of Portland and make the needed changes as allies and not adversaries. Director Re said in a previous meeting that updating the code is a referendum on government, but not a commentary on who was supported in the past. I hope that civic life will show us that by including those of us who have been supported in the past as we all move into the future. The audit I referenced in the letter are available on our website, brentwood-darlington.org.
Okay, so before we take questions, and I want to do this just because I've attended other neighborhood associations where this format happened. I think, so Civic Live comes and says something, and then a neighborhood association representative says something, but then there's no communication between the two, and I think the benefit of having the different points of view here at the same time is to maybe give each party a chance to either clarify, address some of the things that the other party said, since we're all here. So, for example, just giving a random example, if Linda wants to address something that Chelsea said, this is a good time. Or if Chelsea wants to ask Linda to clarify, or ask Sabrina to clarify something, we can do that too, since it's kind of a panel, and definitely leave time for questions. Linda or Sabrina, is there anything that you want to address from what Chelsea said?
Yes. First I really want to thank you, Chelsea, for being here with us, and I really do mean that. There have been a lot of changes in the Bureau over the last 2 years, and if the charge is you have not always communicated well enough with us what you are doing, I would say yes. We can invest better resources into how we communicate. Because, one of the things about this conversation that gets lost is really even what happens at the level of code and what happens in other areas. And so you bring a really good point when you say, how come neighborhood coalitions in East Portland are not funded at the same rate as other coalition answers? And when I hear that, that is an example for me where I say we really should have communicated that better, because actually last year for the first time we fixed that disparity. And we actually, in the past there was an agreement between coalition offices that to fix those disparities would depend on new resources from the city. And so we said, great, we requested new resources for the East Portland office to bring us to parity. And council said, you know what, where did you even get this funding formula? And you need to find parity within the resources that you do have. And so we had to talk to our coalition offices about that, and we worked through that together. And actually, for the first time, the funding per person at the East Portland office is very close to what it is at Southeast Uplands. I think it's a difference of like 2 cents. And that's a problem that the Bureau had not been able to solve for 20 years. And that example of how being committed to that commitment, while well-intentioned, actually locks disparities into place. And so at the code level, we're having the same conversation. We can't say, and it's not enough to say, until we have more resources, we're going to keep the disparities as they are. And so we've committed and we have demonstrated that with the coalition funding as just one example. And with the coalition funding, we said, great, now per person, it looks equitable, but we also know that that's not really equity, right? And how do we actually ask the deeper and more important questions? Like, if we know that more people will be in East Portland than other parts of the city, how does that actually go into our formula? And if we know that displacement has happened, and if we know that the amount of money that people earn in East Portland is different. And also, at the end of all of that, what is it that we actually want our coalitions to do? Like, what do we actually expect as a city? And then what do communities expect them to deliver? And so those are all questions that we're asking that are separate but related to code, but I think are indicative of maybe where we're going with the code change and the kinds of questions that we're asking.
Chelsea, was there anything you would like to respond to?
I just want to note that if the code change goes through, will East Portland here and North Portland keep their city-funded coalitions?
So, this report is on our website, and we can, I'll make sure that it's very visible. But as a part of that report, we said we need to ask the deeper questions that we have neglected as a bureau for the last 20, 30 years. And so one of those questions is, does it make sense that we have two of these coalition offices that are city-run, and we have 5 of them that are independent nonprofits? Does that make sense? What are the reasons that we would want that? If we make a change, what does that mean? And that process and those conversations are happening separate from code. And so it's not as if, if this code changes, then that conversation is happening with or without the code. And there's a different process for engagement for that conversation. Does that answer? I'm sorry. I really want to make sure that I answer your question. And I also at the level of code, and why it's helpful to see other codes as well, is that, it really is intended to set a strategic direction for the Bureau at the level of code. It doesn't answer every possible funding question. And so the strategic question, and maybe to your earlier point about how is this actually better for groups that we don't currently serve? I mean, the number one thing is that it reduces barriers to engagement. We say, we will actually recognize you as you are in the many ways that you organize, and for many of us, that actually is more than one way. And we don't need you to come through a particular system to be served. So, I'm sorry, I feel like
Well, to clarify what they're saying, so they're referring to the East Portland District Coalition, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, which is the district coalition that Lents is under, along with about 12 or 13 others. And so, 95 neighborhood associations spread out across the city, and then there's all these little groupings of district coalitions, and East Portland is one of the 2, so East Portland and North Portland, that are city-run. And the other ones are, I don't really know.
We're under Southeast Uplift, which is an independent nonprofit, and when they struggle, we struggle, and they struggle a lot.
Yeah, so right now in East Portland, for our neighborhood association, we have city staff, and there's some talk that might change. But Winta is saying that's independent from the city code conversation. Okay, so now I'm going to trade microphones with you all. Okay. All right. And I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. Yes.
I'm really bad with names. Can you remind me your name?
Chelsea.
Chelsea. So Chelsea asked the question that I think is really important, and that is transparency. And what this is proposing, and in your FAQs, is an association or a volunteer group or whatever no longer has to follow public meeting laws, and therefore is not held accountable to the rest of the community or the public at large. Why would you allow that to happen if you're going to funnel money into that organization? Because I could see, and I think that maybe a lot of people in East Portland in particular feel that we are not treated the same as those in the Pearl District or downtown or wherever the city council currently resides. That they can have now an association without having any accountability. They can get funds from the city, and it's all hush-hush, because there's no way to track it. We already have that issue, I believe, with the East Portland Action Plan that is like wholly funded by the city, and the East Portland Action Plan says, well, we don't have to share anything and tell you anything. we don't fall under public meeting law, which I think is not correct. But why would you take away accountability, especially after Udaley's office just got hammered by the public records law saying that everybody's trying to sneakily get this passed?
So I guess we'll both kind of respond a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. So first thing I want to talk about is accountability and transparency for whom, right? Because chapter 3, and I know this is very technical stuff, but this code is really making sure that the community is holding the Office of Community and Civic Life accountable. So it is doing a little bit something different in terms of flipping it on what does the Office of Community and Civic Life need to be doing to serve all Portlanders and serve the community. Another distinction that I want to make is that when we're talking about providing services such as community safety, which was formerly known as crime prevention, or connecting you, like information referral, connecting you with offices, we don't feel like there needs to be open meeting rules in order to connect you with your government and connect you with each other. When it comes to funding, that is a different process. There absolutely is a process when you are contracting. The city has no problem asking for a whole bunch of technical things in order to make sure that who we're funding with and who we're providing grants to and things of that nature are abiding by certain rules. So I do want to make sure that that distinction is made, because when it comes to governments answering your call and connecting you with other areas of government, information referral, community safety, we're serving all Portlanders, and that is what government should be doing. And when it comes to funding, there is a separate process for that that is more stringent. And I will allow Lisa to add on to that.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad that you raised the East Portland Action Plan, because that's actually a really good example of a group that is independently funded and has a different source of funding, but they follow the public meeting requirements even though they're not required to, and they're able to do that successfully because they have paid staff. And so I did actually just a brief audit of a random sampling of 50% of our neighborhood associations to see who is actually complying with the public meeting requirements. And of the 45 that I analyzed, we have exactly 5 of them who are. And the reason is that is a really unfair burden to put on volunteer groups who are ultimately there to connect with each other and to do important projects in their neighborhoods. So where we are actually exchanging money, we will have a higher standard for transparency, for accountability. Where you are working with your neighbors, one, it's not true that neighborhood associations are following this. And two, it makes perfect sense because city attorneys, the DOJ, state attorneys have said open meeting requirements are not intended for volunteer groups. They're intended for public bodies, and they are a good thing for the right groups. And the final thing that I want to say on this issue too, and one of the matters that the committee deliberated is, if we are going to have a set of standards for one organization or one type of organization, and we're saying we want to serve many different types, then what is the rationale for holding certain groups to this standard and others to other standards? And the reality is other types of groups have lots of other ways for how they ensure transparency and accountability, and we reject the idea that neighborhood associations are adopting these practices because the city is forcing them to. And so any groups that want to continue to follow them, it's completely optional, and if it makes sense for your organization, we encourage you to adopt the practices that make sense for your group.
Okay, so you're talking around it again, and I'm being very specific about if they get funding from the city, public funds. So if an association is getting public funds, right, then they are accountable under public meeting law according to the DOJ. Now, I'm not going to argue about it. I just want to know, you said that if an association does get public funds, you are going to handle that differently, but it does not say that in here, and it does not say that on your FAQs.
Yes, so when funds are being exchanged, that actually lives in the grant agreement. When it lives in code, what happens is that they're unenforceable. So the way that they are now, our option for neighborhood associations that are not perfectly meeting that standard is that we would unrecognize them. We don't think that's a good path to take. You know, why would we take away your right to be informed? Because you're really doing, most neighborhood associations are doing their best anyway. And so we're saying that where we're exchanging money, that actually goes into our grant agreement, and where that agreement has been broken, there's an enforceable action. We can take away the funds. And so it's moving to what can we actually enforce as much as anything else.
I'm sorry, and you said that EPAP is not funded by the city?
It is funded by the city, but it is not a neighborhood association.
No, it is.
Okay,
Can I refer a camera point really fast?
okay, sure, really fast.
I just want to say two things. We only keep records and minutes and all of that stuff because you guys make us. I promise you that. I don't have a secretary right now, and every meeting I have to beg somebody to take minutes. And the other thing is that taking minutes and those things are much less of a burden than learning to write grants and apply for them if our coalition doesn't receive their funding because of their own fiscal issues. So those are just the two counterpoints to that I wanted to bring up.
Okay. So in order to make room for more questions, because we're kind of running out of time, when we have a question from the floor, we're not going to have time by every single panelist to answer. And then whoever is answering, try to keep it to about a minute. And I'll have to cut you off, I'm sorry, but I want to make room for more questions. Okay, yes. Oh, sure.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that last question. Did I hear you correctly that you surveyed 45 neighborhood associations and only 5 met the open meetings law for public records? And if so, in what manner did they fall short?
So what I looked at was, in the last 6 months, did they post their minutes, and did the minutes include the components of what they should look like? Were the attendees listed? Were actions clearly taken? And where there was a vote where it was not unanimous, was there a description of what happened? And again, this is a brief look, and really the point that I'm making here is that we don't think this is the best role. We think that Civic Life's role is actually to support community engagement, and that we don't need to enforce public meeting laws when you are, I see you're wanting to ask a question.
Well, as a 10-year secretary of a neighborhood association, I don't think I ever saw any stated rules for what's supposed to be in the minutes, so I kind of went by what the governments typically do. And you said when there was dissent, a non-unanimous vote, you're supposed to list the arguments. I don't recall seeing that anywhere.
Yes, so sir, that is what is in the standards. That's in the current code that we are trying to change. And the reason we're trying to change it is because it doesn't make sense for the exact reasons that you're describing. That neighborhood associations as volunteer groups do not come together to study public meeting laws and to dig into the depths of code. And so we need to evaluate our own practices to see where are we, proactively facilitating community's ability to get to know each other and to work with government.
Well, yeah, but why toss out the whole thing because the minutes aren't perfect? I mean, just let them have minutes and say, okay, that's good, you got minutes, now what else are you doing?
That's
Instead,
exactly,
you're trying to get rid of the requirement completely.
That's exactly what we're saying. We're saying by making them optional, you adopt the practices that make sense for your neighborhood association, and instead of policing your behavior, we can actually work with you to figure out what it is that you actually want to accomplish, and then how do we connect you to other folks who we know want to accomplish similar things.
Okay.
While you walk to that question, can I say one thing? I would argue that we're at a community meeting to talk about code change. So you said people don't come together to talk about city code and delve into it, but this is like the 3rd or 4th meeting I've been to about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma because we tell board members that you don't have to have prior experience to run for the board. You don't need to know anything, but then you come in and now there's this very cumbersome process. You have to understand grievances and what the process is. You have to understand public meeting law. You have to know how to run a nonprofit and what the deadlines are. And it's hard sometimes to get any business done because as a volunteer, you know, like you only have so many hours to put into something. And when you have to spend all this time complying with all these regulations, first of all, it takes my enthusiasm away, and second of all, it just takes too much time. So,
Sabrina, I have a clarification. Could you alternate women and men perhaps? I'm noticing that it's been all men so far asking questions. I'm wondering if you might consider alternating.
I just went with whoever had their hands up, but
Just a question.
sure.
Just a noticing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. After this question, I will try to make room for more voices.
Thank you. Sabrina, before you, I just really want to echo what Sabrina just said. Or, I'm sorry, Sabina. I've got Sabrina here. What Sabina just said. What you just described is exactly the point. The barrier to entry to work with our Bureau is entirely too high, and that is exactly the point that we are making.
But will it be that high for getting funding? Not notifications. The notifications anybody can get, but funding. What are the requirements? Because you keep saying there's not going to be requirements unless there's funding, and there's these mystical funding requirements that we don't know about.
Let's take another question.
First, please don't presume gender. It's insulting.
I know, but it's also something to note.
Right,
Yeah.
presuming gender. I don't appreciate that.
No, but we need to know what's happening in the room.
Do you need to know my
I
gender?
think we should stick to
Keep
the
going.
conversation.
Yeah, but I think it's important to note that not all genders are visibly apparent. It's insulting to presume that.
I know
So,
that.
Thank you. So there's, 22,000 residents in Lents, and by your thing, you've surveyed 1,000 Portlanders. I think that's horrible for engaging in the community, which is also supposed to be inclusive and responsive. I think it's kind of insulting. In this, you note that the director can adopt administrative rules that establish a process and criteria for managing the list. This seems to be centralizing power in a very backroom fashion. So if people are catering to the particular director, then they have more sway because that person is going to design who gets attention on this list. Further, training is promised as part of being in coalitions, as far as joining the neighborhood association. Paul Leisner, Mingus Maps, both promised trainings they never delivered on, and both were later, I think, terminated or what have you. Not because of that, but just generally. You talk about the coalition offices, which have seen an incredible amount of staff turnover and are failing to deliver the services they're supposed to provide. And you're noting in this that the new direction is to rely on them or turn them out of basically city control. There's an auditor's report from 2016 that notes that ONI is failing to follow its own rules and enforce them. You note that the method to enforce rules is to remove from the coalition, and yet ONI is afraid to do that. So by that design, you're never going to enforce a rule, and yet this removes those rules and doesn't replace them with any rules. So no rules, no standards, except what the particular director decides to do. It just seems like chaos. It doesn't seem to advance everybody. It seems to advance none. It seems to take the one voice that must be listened to and must be interacted with and remove it and say, we're doing it for equality, so nobody will have a voice. And the way this is presented, and I'm familiar with the talking points that kind of dance around this issue, the way this is presented, it's purely subjective to whichever director happens to be sitting in the chair. And I think this has been an appalling effort. On here it talks about 25 community leaders, and I happen to know at least 5 of them that had no idea what the neighborhood association systems even were as they attended them, the meetings. So it's kind of a joke from start to finish in my view, and I think is a disservice to the community. And I think the revelations from the public's requests from the Oregonian, where city staff are effectively making fun of and trivializing community members with a voice that make their way through this bulky system is further horrible. And I don't feel like this actually advances our communities in any way. I think training is promised, or that has been promised and has been in code and stuff, is where the answer lies, and it's been failed to deliver constantly. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Does anyone want to address that really quickly, like in 30 seconds or less, or?
I mean, it sounded like a comment to us.
Right, it didn't seem like a question. Chelsea?
I would say it definitely has been hard to navigate the system as it is, and the city bureaus are not keeping up their end-on training. It's not a unique experience.
Thank you. So there was a comment from the floor that we've only so far in this conversation taken questions from male presenting individuals, and I want to honor that because I think there's a certain privilege associated with male presenting individuals and male voices, and so if any of the femmes in the room feel like they may have felt like intimidated, or just haven't yet stepped up and would like to ask a question, I think it's important to make room for them too. Is there anyone who hasn't felt heard tonight who would like to, from the femmes, and anyone identifying as a femme in the room?
I don't identify as a femme, but I would like to ask a question.
Please do.
And I appreciate your acknowledgement as male presenting versus anything else. Okay, so I would like to establish a little bit more of a collaborative tone in my question, if I may. And I would love to know, in your discussions, has there been any consideration of inviting those folks who are really committed to leveraging our race privilege or class privilege or any of those privileges that are kind of the elephant in the room in this conversation, but which I would like to name because that is one of our goals in Darlington around our equity work, and I very much support the language that you've come up with. I think the way you've stated them, I'm going to leverage the language that you use quite a bit in my work, so I thank you for that. And I wonder if that's been part of the discussion, because that kind of collaboration could be very rich and could really serve the goals that you're looking to accomplish. So that's my question.
Thank you for that. So, absolutely, right? Because, and I hope what is clear. So, one, I'll give an early announcement here. You heard it here first. And so, in section 060, we've heard this question, right, of whether this effectively gives the director the ability to just remove or add, organizations. And that is not the intention. This whole process is not about taking anything away from anyone. And so we're going to present maybe clearer language that gets to that point. Because what that section does is it says, we are not trying to tear anything apart, but we know that we can do better than what we have right now. And that starts with figuring out where we're going. And where we're going requires all of us. And so some of the initiatives in the Bureau that maybe speak to that is our emphasis on the census, for example, which we know we absolutely have to focus our efforts and our resources to reaching our hard-to-count communities. And that is what equity looks like in action. And in doing so, we get a better count for everyone, which results in greater federal resources and greater political representation. But, investing in our hard-to-count communities is not enough. For example, our neighborhood association folks know your neighborhoods really well. And so can we partner on events or other initiatives that you're already working on to say, here's where we're putting our resources because that is where our impact is, but can we use your existing knowledge and your desire to connect with others in your neighborhood too? And I can point to a lot of examples. Another one, so I hear neighborhoods say, we really want to be more inclusive and we don't have access to trainings. And one of the things that we've done, because really the last 2 years since that audit, we've examined every single contract and every single practice to say, does this make sense? What are we actually trying to achieve here? And one of the things that have come from that process is the creation of what's called our Constructing Civic Dialogues program. So where in the past we had a program that was just about neighborhood mediation, which is when neighbors need mediation, we've said, can we use some of those resources and invest them upstream to help neighbors talk about race, class, gender, and learn how to facilitate meetings effectively? And is that a different way to get to a better outcome? So those trainings we push through our neighborhood networks, but there are many examples of how what we put here in this code really it's not about pitting communities together. It's identity plus issue plus place. And I hope that neighborhoods see a place for themselves, because there absolutely is a place for neighborhood associations in the work of the Bureau.
Thank you for that.
We don't have any more time. We just went over okay, if it's a quick question, we'll make it quick. Last question.
Well, I just want to say, because this is the last Lents Neighborhood Association meeting I get to ever be at least for the next 4 years, because I'm on the Planning and Sustainability Commission, and it happens the same time. So I just want to say very quickly that, and it's going to be a little dangerous, because for the next 3 weeks I'm still working with Civic Life, but I'm also a Lents resident, and when I moved here 5 years ago, I actually became involved in the Jade District because I cared so much about anti-displacement and knew 5 years ago what we know now through the RIP, that Lents is actively being displaced, and it is next. It is next. And so the Jade District has been working on a visioning plan, and they are a neighborhood-based, place-based organization that does not receive recognition through the current code. And they are a people of color-led organization, one of so many that are place-based, that also doesn't have immediate access to things like land use notifications, even though like a lot of folks from the Jade District and a lot of those communities have already been displaced through historic racism from Old Town Chinatown. So I just want to note, and I'm so happy to be in Lents. I was born at Park Rose. Like I have told my partner who lives in Lair Hill, the only reason that I would not live in East Portland is if I lived in a different state. But I just want to recognize that there are a lot of neighborhood-based organizations and other organizations that we choose, and because we choose one, like the commission, we can't choose others. And I'm just excited for this conversation to continue and for the future.
Sabina, we forgot to ask a really important question, which is what can we expect next in September and October before the vote? I forgot to ask that. Can you tell us what kind of
some of the kind of like closing remarks, and then how can people contact you if they have more questions and all that?
Okay, so if you look at the fact sheet, at the bottom of that, the one with the pictures, at the bottom of that is Sabrina's contact information. And I think Sabina can probably share my contact in the minutes as well. What is next is going to be the council hearing sometime in November.
And before that, for community input?
No, I'm just saying that's when the council hearing is. And between that, we found that coming to meetings is actually the best place for these conversations and input. And so we're going to as many community events, including neighborhood associations, as we can possibly fit into our schedule. So if you have a group that you want us to talk to, send it to Sabrina. I know Brentwood Darlington is on our list. Yeah, so send your request our way.
Lents neighbors, if we do manage to get them on their schedule at our Brentwood Darlington Community Center, our meetings are the first Thursday of the month, but I think we'll have them on a Tuesday when we also have the building rented. Lents neighbors, welcome. We welcome everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like overall more conversation needs to happen. It seems like Civic Life has, started this process of making community involvement more equitable and making room for more voices. And then there's also people like us who have lived experiences with neighborhood associations who can maybe provide input in terms of how the process for engagement has worked for us so far, and what we've learned and what we would like to see different too, so that it works for us as well. Because we have this experience here on the ground, and yeah. So thank you, Winta, Sabrina, and Chelsea for coming, and thank you for talking to us, and we will share your contact info if anyone has any other questions.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah.